Thank you very much for that enthusiastic welcome. I hope there will be equal enthusiasm at the end of the session after you've heard what the very distinguished panelists have to say. So my name is Martin Wolf. I'm from the Financial Times. The subject is one that I've followed very closely for many years. I think the introduction has to be fairly simple. Most of us on the planet, not alas all, accept that climate change is one of the great existential questions of our age, of enormous significance to the future of humanity and indeed life more widely as we know it in the planet. The international community has put forward the aspiration of limiting emissions in such a way that projected future warming will not be greater than 2 degrees centigrade. Unfortunately, those who follow this closely will recognize that we have very far from achieved that any cuts that make it likely that we will actually be able to hit that target. A crucial stage in transforming that depressing path comes in Paris in December with the Conference of the Parties, COP21. And in that context, among other things, there has been quite rightly a huge debate about the financing of future, current and future mitigation efforts, particularly in developing countries, emerging and developing countries. There's been a promise to mobilize 100 billion a year. And this, of course, concerns both at the widest level of the goal for us and in this more narrow sense, very much all the people on this panel. So that's the issue we want to discuss. And I think it goes from the absolutely fundamental objective to the question of, well, put bluntly, why have we been so unsuccessful in doing anything sensible about it? And is it now going to be a turning point? The panelists are people you all know, so I'm going to introduce them very quickly. They are in order from my left, Christine Lagarde, Managing Director of the IMF. To her left, Jim Kim, who's President of the World Bank. To his left, Cristina Figueres, who's Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change Management, and deeply, as I know, engaged in the whole question of what was going to happen in COP21. And finally, to her left, Nick Stern, who is famous, among other things, for the Stern Review, or was it the Stern Report? Review, I thought it was Review, which I think had a seminal role in shifting people's views of the issue, particularly economists, but not only economists, when it came out. So let me start, after this brief introduction, with the first question for the panelists. There is a very broad acceptance that what needs to be done, even some acceptance of the best way to do it through pricing arrangements, and indeed ideally a global pricing arrangements. But so far, the truth is we have been extraordinarily unsuccessful in achieving a global system, and certainly one that has actually made any difference or any significant difference to the path of emissions. So is there any reason whatsoever to believe that anything is going to be different now, or is it just going to be more talk and very little action? Christine Lagarde, how would you respond to that question? How would you persuade this audience that things are actually going to be different?
Thank you very much, Martin. And those I would like to persuade, in addition to the audience, which I believe is probably interested in the matter and doesn't need much effort, are actually the finance ministers. Because I believe that finance ministers have a vested interest in pursuing exactly what you said. Pretty much around the world, finance ministers are looking for revenues. That's the fate of finance ministers, but it's particularly the case at the moment because many have already used a lot of their fiscal buffers, if you look at Latin America, and are always in need of some fiscal buffers in order to fight the next crisis. Well, in addition to that, there's also a moment right now where fossil fuel energy is cheap. Now, it has some goods and bads, and Christina is far more competent than me to describe what the benefits and downside of that is. But one thing for sure is that it is just the right moment to introduce carbon tax. And it is just the right moment as well to eliminate subsidies. So from the IMF perspective, because we look at fiscal, first of all, and how it can be helpful for humanity, how it can be helpful to fight against climate change, we say to finance ministers, if you want more revenue, now is the time to include the externalities into fossil fuel energies to determine the right pricing. So get the price right, and to actually include carbon tax into generally your fuel taxes that exist already. And for those of the finance ministers who manage subsidies, now is the right time to actually gradually phase out your subsidies and make sure that these 5.4 trillions lost in either subsidies or the direct and indirect consequences of having in place those subsidies can actually go into the right directions, which could be much more helpful for sustainable development. I'll stop here.
So, if not now, when? The argument seems very persuasive, but I've been trying to make similar arguments in price collapse periods before without much success, but I hope we do better.
But the threat is real, and Nick can demonstrate that beautifully with his book and lots of other things that he has said before.
So let me turn to you, Jim Kim. Beyond, and I'm sure you want to comment on this, the revenue and other questions from the World Bank, there must be very much this question of how you finance the investment and the scale of the investment needed, particularly in emerging and developing countries, the role of external finance and the role of the World Bank in this. So how do you perceive this? Are we on track to providing the financing that is actually needed? Is even 100 billion even begin to be enough? Even if we could get that, it sounds to me grossly inadequate. So I'd be very interested in your comment.
Well, Martin, let me just start by saying that things have changed in terms of the discussion around a price on carbon. Literally 2 years ago, there was very little talk of any real movement toward it. And then last year at the UN General Assembly, we circulated a document in which some 52% of the world's population in countries and more than 1,000 companies signed onto a statement saying we need a carbon price. At Davos last year, it was a completely different atmosphere, and the energy companies were coming on board and saying, look, we know it's going to happen. It's better for us if you do it now and more quickly. You're right that a depressingly small percentage of the emissions in the world is covered, is happening in places where there's an effective tax. But China has got a program going, and there is now this carbon pricing leadership coalition, and we just got to take it the next step. It's the critical piece of aligning incentives so that people really will look to innovating quickly. But here's what I would say about the finance. If you want to have a sense of the ambition of the world today, take a look at some of these so-called INDCs, the nationally determined contributions of the countries. China has an incredibly ambitious plan for mitigation. Some $6 trillion in investments. India has a very ambitious plan. And so the demand, we think, is there. Now, in terms of how we finance it, we're seeing increased demand from countries. And the way we have to think about it now is that there's not a single infrastructure investment we can make. I mean, Nick's made this point brilliantly. We have to now ask ourselves, in every infrastructure investment that we make, can we do it in a way that is climate smart? Can we do it in a way that is going to reduce our overall carbon emissions? So yes, we're going to need a lot more. And again, the 100 billion is a good start, but it looks like we're going to need trillions of financing going forward. And now we just have to get better and better every day at looking at our portfolio and saying, are there better ways of doing this? There are ways to build roads that are more climate smart, that help to build resilience. That's what we've got to do on both those. Increase the amount and also increase the degree to which we make every single infrastructure investment climate smart.
Thank you very much. May I turn to you, Christiana? If you could outline for us how you see COP21, whether it is really going to be a turning point, and how this fits in quite particularly with the issue that has Jim Kim has mentioned, also Christine Lagarde to some degree, which is where do the emerging and developing countries fit in? how are they going to play? After all, they're already responsible about half the emissions. They're going to be responsible for most of the growth and in them. But at the same time, they desperately want economic growth. They want, rightly, they don't want this to be a burden on the poor. We're going to come to this in a moment. So how do you see the situation?
Well, I actually see that we're already seeing the turning point, even before we get to COP21, which is actually quite exciting. But that always has, you know, sort of a shadow side and a bright side. Let's first look on the bright side. Have we done anything at all? Let's just establish that first. The fact is that compared to where we were just 5 or 6 years ago, which is a moment's time, we have actually already progressed enormously. Where we were 5 or 6 years ago in terms of policy and in terms of measures that would have addressed climate change was we were heading straight for at least a 4 to 5 degree increase in temperature, which would have been nothing short of catastrophic. 5 or 6 years later, because of the different policies that countries have actually already enacted or have identified that they can enact, we have now brought down the risk to be somewhere in the range of a 3 degree increase. Still dangerous, but better than where we were before, and still pointing to the fact that we need to increase. Now, those, Jim has already referred to the INDC, sorry about the acronym, let's call them just national climate change plans that countries are putting forward. The good news about that is we have 146 countries, 146, all industrialized countries, plus about 100 developing countries who have already presented their climate change plans that are a very, very clear indication of what they intend to do starting in 2020 on climate change. Those plans are possible because countries, in particular developing countries, have realized over time, over the past 2 to 3 years, that all these measures are not being enacted because they want to save the planet, although many of us here would like to save the planet. They're being enacted because it is in their own self-interest. That is a fundamental realization that has made these plans possible and that is now beginning to accelerate policy and capital shift. Fundamental shift in where we were to a few years ago. Now, here is where I get impatient. I get appreciative about all of this there because it certainly is an improvement, but it is not going to get us to the 2 degrees in the timing that we need. There is an urgency about climate change that is lacking in all other development issues because climate could be such a negative impact. So point number one, just because those policies and measures have been put there by countries to start in 2020 doesn't mean we have to wait until then. They've already been identified. They are in the self-interest. Policies can be fast-forwarded, and above all, capital shifts can be fast-forwarded. So fast-forward everything that you already have on paper, and secondly, further scale up. See how quickly can we get to closing the gap between the 3 degrees and 2. I think it's entirely doable.
So on this subject, Nick Stern, you have the last word this round. So you've heard a lot about the opportunity to move to carbon pricing at this unique time. Otherwise, the collapse in energy oil prices is actually a bit of a problem from this point of view. You've heard about investment options and plans and the scale of them that are being considered, and you've heard about the idea that we are on the point of a genuine and fundamental shift. As a journalist, I'm professionally skeptic about these things, you must understand. So I'd be interested in how you see where we are and the opportunities and risks, particularly in the context of this sort of focus on a global policy arrangement which will actually work.
Let me start by pointing to some positive things. You gave the impression in the introduction, Martin, that it was all absolutely hopeless and nothing was happening. Well, the energy usage in rich countries has started to fall. The majority of investment in electricity is now in low-carbon electricity in rich countries. Majority of investment in China is in electricity is now in low-carbon technologies, and coal has peaked in China, started to fall. It might fall slowly, but at least it started to fall. The price of a PV unit has fallen by a factor of 10 in the last 10 years or so. So it's not all negative. There's increasing realization of what's possible and some examples of what's possible. There is deeper understanding of the way in which economic growth and poverty reduction on the one hand and climate on the other are not separate. They're interwoven, they're intertwined, and the horse race that is often put one against the other is artificial, and we've started to understand that better. The better understanding of air pollution is going to be a big part of this story. Perhaps 3.5 or so million people a year dying from external, perhaps even a bit more dying from internal air pollution. That's changing the debate as well. So there's lots of things that are moving the debate and moving the action in a positive direction that's not negligible. But, it's a very big but, it's nowhere near fast enough. And I don't think yet the leaders of the world who declare for 2 degrees really have taken on board what's involved in getting there. We have to divide emissions per unit of output between now and mid-century by a factor of around 7 or 8. It means we have to be zero carbon by mid-century in quite a lot of areas, and probably zero carbon as a world by the net zero carbon as a world by the end of the century. I don't think they understand that. And above all, I don't think they understand the criticality of the next 20 years. We're already at 400 parts per million CO2, 450 parts per million CO2 equivalent. That's already bordering on what's possible for 2 degrees. The next 20 years will determine, if we go on going up too fast, whether we're able to hold. And the next 20 years also will determine what structure our cities and energy systems are. You've got 3.5 billion people in cities now. It'll be 6.5 billion by mid-century. That happens only once in economic history. If we get that wrong, the building of the energy systems and these cities will be in deep, deep trouble. So you've got these two things, critical 20 years for carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, a critical 20 years for the building of our cities and infrastructure. If we get this wrong, if we don't move fast enough, if we say the penny's gradually dropping, so that's fine, that seems to me would be a mistake, a deep mistake from which it's difficult to extricate ourselves. So you can point to the positive things, and I would point to the positive things because there's something to build on, real something to build on. But I do worry that the scale and urgency is not sufficiently understood, and in particular, the crucial nature of the next 20 years.
Well, I would argue that your very clear and compelling statement clarifies and elucidates the reason for my profound skepticism. Because, as you said, and we'll come to this now, it's absolutely clear people are more concerned about this, and it's absolutely clear that there are some changes occurring. But as you also pointed out, we are talking about a once in, as it were, in history opportunity to re-engineer our patterns of living, our transport systems, and our power generation systems. And it has to happen in the next 20 years.
But Martin, I'm very optimistic about what we can do. Okay. You can see the tremendous way of living. So you have to begin by establishing what you can do and that it's attractive. That's a precondition for persuading people to do it. So if you're already optimistic, as I am, about the different kinds of things we can do, that this is the best way to overcome poverty in a sustainable way, that our cities and methods of living will be much more attractive than they are now, that's the first step. And it's wrong to dismiss that. You can't have optimism about what you will do unless you've got optimism about what you can do.
I accept that. So let's move on to some of the really big issues. One that I think is particularly important in getting the step from where we are now to actually convincing the world as a whole to act is that the way we tackle this is seen to be globally fair, and that particularly the burden does not fall in any way on the world's poorest. Because this has to be a global agreement, and it can't be done at their expense. And there's obviously the particular and completely understandable resentment that, historically, the free sink, as it were, of the atmosphere was used by the developed countries because they came first. So I'd like to start with you, Jim Kim, on this question, but I'm sure you all have something to think. How do we tackle the big internal and global distributional questions which are needed to get a genuine, solid, and legitimate agreement, which everybody feels they are committed to? Because there will clearly be some costs. I accept completely what Nick Stern says. There are many big gains, but there are going to be some costs, and they have to be borne fairly. So how do you see that, and how do you actually feel your own institution fits into that?
Well, you know, we hear all the time, especially from people in Africa, for example, who say, you know, we didn't put the carbon in the air, but we're actually feeling the effects of it most severely. You know, the boot of carbon, of climate change is already on our necks, and now you're telling us that we can't have energy? You know, there are discussions in which, you know, the Africans are told, you know, no nuclear, no hydro, no coal, and they're saying, but that just makes no sense. And so I think we have to, first of all, find the financing. And this is the, as you know, Martin, this is the big conversation at this meeting. And we're all really looking at our balance sheets and trying to find the most creative ways of getting the numbers up even higher because of the need. But I think that it goes back to the fundamentals. First of all, you know, we do need a price on carbon. We need, if there were ways of, for example, harnessing solar energy so that it could contribute to the base load, you know, this is something that would be great. And I think with the carbon price, the innovation would just take off. I think that there are some really interesting experiments. In the Philippines, for example, if you put solar panels on your house and you generate excess electricity, you can put it back on the grid and get credit for it, right? So this should be available in all developing countries. But the bottom line is that they deserve to have energy. The one critical missing element in their ability to industrialize and their ability to grow is energy right now in many of the poor countries. So we have to both commit that all the countries will get energy, but then we really have to work to find ways of making it more sustainable. You know, Nick talked about this, and I just met with the CEO of a Canadian company, and he said that the price of solar now is around 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Which when I started my job just 3 years and some months ago, the lowest price we heard of was 15 cents. So it's happening, and the demand and the price drop looks like no industry since cellular phones in terms of increasing demand. So I think people are beginning to come around to understanding that one, poor people deserve energy, but that we've now just got to find ways of getting it to them at a lower cost. And of course, the other issue is we've really just got to get rid of these fossil fuel subsidies, among the most regressive taxes in the world. And so many developing countries are really wasting resources on subsidies that benefit the rich far more than the poor. There are many other ways of ensuring that the poor have access to electricity.
Can I just make clear, and others might comment on it, are you trying to suggest, because this is quite important, that, as it were, we've got to the point in technology where there aren't costs, there's just benefits? That becomes very easy. It seems to me that the general discussion implies there are still some, even if you've got optimal policy, there are costs, as we are now. At the least, there are very large investment costs. So there still is a question, isn't there, about how these costs are distributed, as well as how the benefits are distributed. I mean, we can't ignore that. Right. We can't just say there isn't a problem.
Right. In Copenhagen in 2009, I mean, the number was set, 100 billion a year by 2020. And, you know, I think there is a collective effort on the part of certainly all the multilateral development banks and the bilaterals. We're trying to now rethink. And I have to tell you, the so-called national plans, the nationally determined contributions, the national plans were really encouraging, because the ambition among the developing countries is extremely high. So now it's a matter of us, you know, rethinking how we adjust our portfolio to try to help meet that demand.
Could I say an additional word to costs, to complement that? Because it is true that these 100 billion were put in Copenhagen there as a political signal. It's the tail that wags the dog, right? The dog is about trillions of dollars.
Of course.
That's what we're really needing. And so when you talk about costs, Martin, you're talking about certainly about financial costs, but we're also talking about infrastructure costs, policy costs, technology costs, human costs. There's a huge, you know, universe there. And so what is truly needed here is, at an accelerated pace, to support developing countries to do with energy what has been done, as Jim has just noted, with cellular telephony. right? Just completely leapfrog this whole landline thing, analogous to extending the grid where it's no longer possible, and move toward decentralized renewable energy that is actually going to get access to energy and is going to allow for a much better and much more stable development. That's one part of it, and developing countries need to be able to have access to all of the different factors that will allow them to do that. That's one part of the conversation, and it is in their interest to do so. The other part of the conversation when it comes to equity, however, and fairness is not just the opportunity that needs to be open to them, but what are we going to do with the true painful human cost of the negative impacts of climate change? That's the whole adaptation discussion that also needs to be there if we're talking about equity. And in order to be able to face and be able to address those costs, they also need support, for the very simple reason that, yes, while in the future they will be high emitters, they were certainly not the ones that caused it. That's not ideology, that's just a fact, that there is a subset of countries that have caused this historically and therefore do have the moral responsibility to help developing countries, in particular with the negative impacts of climate change.
So we have the costs of mitigation, and I agree completely, much bigger costs of adaptation, and the even bigger costs of non-adaptation. And obviously it's because we believe the latter is so overwhelming that we want to change it. So there is clearly a positive sum relative to the base of continuing. There's no doubt about that at all. Just before the other two, Christine Lagarde, how do you see handling these distributional questions which arise in terms of what are clearly a range of costs, both of managing mitigation and of actually managing adaptation, since we're not going to fully mitigate? How do you see that being handled in the discussions you have?
4 very, very quick points. First of all, there has been a change of rhetorics. You referred to the developing world on the one hand, the advanced economies on the other hand. I think there's been a change of rhetorics. And that is caused by the second point I would like to make, which is that irrespective of what others are doing, it is in a country's own interest to actually move in the direction of taking the right measures, adopting technologies that will actually fight climate change. I think the third element also that has changed is that there is peer pressure which is exercised by some of the emerging market economies. When you have countries like China, for instance, saying, I commit X billion dollars to help developing countries adapt to climate change. It's an interesting signal that is given to others, including advanced economies. And in terms of the two last points I'd like to make, I'm sorry to be obsessed with that, but setting up the right pricing, having carbon taxation. I know that many people would rather do an emission trading system, but we believe that carbon taxation would be a lot better. But having carbon taxation in place and actually diverting a little bit of that taxation to the financing of that 100 billion commitment for 2020 on an annual basis would not take a lot. If all advanced economies were spending 6% of that carbon taxation, assuming a valuation of $35 per ton, which is not a lot, you would already have about a fourth of that financing put in place. And to the redistribution aspect, I think the worst use of public spending is to actually spend on subsidies, because subsidies actually go to the wrong people. They don't go to the people in need. They don't go to the poor. They go to those that need it least. So removing that is also a good way to deal with the issue of redistribution.
Nick Stern, how do you respond to this set of arguments and the whole question of creating what is seen as a distributionally legitimate and just settlement on which we can now build, given the urgency?
I think you have to begin by recognizing clearly and strongly that there is a serious inequity here. The rich countries, as we've all agreed, are responsible for around half or so of the concentrations we now see, but it's the poor countries that are hit.
I think even more than half of the concentrations.
Current concentrations.
Yes. Yeah. If you add the current concentrations,
if you integrate all past emissions,
I think it's important. It's more, even more.
Yeah. So recognize it first. But don't draw the wrong conclusions. And I was sat on a panel on Africa Day at the Durban COP, and Melad Zenawi, who I was helping him do this, negotiated the 100 billion, and we were negotiating with Mike Froman and eventually Hillary Clinton. He was very careful, after speaking very powerfully about the inequity, to say, but it is not justice to foul the planet, these are his words, because others have fouled the planet in the past. That isn't a sensible way forward. That's a destructive, mutually destructive way forward. You've got to draw the right conclusions. And the right conclusions is, I think, equitable access to sustainable development, the language of Cancun, COP16. So what we should look to do is to work hard to produce the investment, and it's mostly infrastructure investment that will drive the reduction of poverty. We have to increase infrastructure investment around the world from about 3 trillion a year to about 6 trillion a year in the next 10 years or so, and most of that will be in developing and emerging market countries.
And make it clean.
And that investment has to be done in a way that is clean, and we have to put the incentives in place to make that clean. But we also have to have the finance to make that clean. And one thing that rich countries can and should do is to work very hard to get that finance in place. Probably about $1 trillion extra from the public sector. Carbon pricing would finance that very nicely, thank you, and put the right incentives in place. But we'd need probably at least another $1 trillion financed through the private sector. And it's here that the world's development banks have such a powerful role to play. Because I was chief economist of the EBRD as well as chief economist of the World Bank, and enjoyed both, I should insist. But at the EBRD, we worked very closely with the private sector. And they would come into a deal because they felt more secure with the development bank in there. They would trust the development bank more as a convener than a private sector bank. The development bank can take a longer time horizon than the private sector. So leveraging in that extra $1 trillion from the private sector requires a major expansion in the lending of the development banking system, national and international, around the world. Perhaps from 40 billion a year in infrastructure to 200. Because then if you've got 200 billion a year in infrastructure and you put some leverage multipliers into that, then you're talking real money. You're starting to approach $1 trillion to help the private sector in that one. So overcome the problem in a way that brings energy, transport, water to poor people. Do it in a way that's clean. Do it in a way that prioritizes access to poor people, sustainable energy for all. That would be a very big thing we could do. And to do that, you've got to cut the cost of capital. If you can cut it from 6% real to 3% real, you're close to half the cost of a renewable, which is mostly capital cost. That itself would transform the competitiveness and the ability to get things financed. Put some decent carbon pricing and regulation for pollutant on top of that, the renewables will take the whole world by storm. And that is what you can make happen. But it does need strong action by the rich countries to reduce their own emissions, and strong action by the rich countries to support the international financial system to bring that low-cost, efficient, clean finance to the system.
You could argue, I suppose, and of course I've made this argument in domestic context, that when so many governments can borrow apparently limitless quantities at zero real, the cost of capital shouldn't be an enormous problem, but persuading them that this is the case is unfortunately very difficult. This brings me to the sort of roundup before we go to questions from the audience. So we've heard about a range of priorities in terms of finance ministers, the pricing question. Yeah. I'm very much with you on pricing rather than cap and trade, but we can go there if you want. I've been there for years. There's the question of investment and the financing of investment. We haven't talked much about the transmission of technological know-how and whether you think that's a problem. It seems to me that is an issue. There are also quite definite questions. Some places will bear real costs, and who bears that so there's distributional questions there too. So the question I have here is, what is, as a way, if you look at it overall, the right policy package that will deliver this? and how far are we towards getting it? And the thing that particularly worries me from the things you've been saying that are very optimistic, which I, to a degree, accept, is these are national plans, very different national plans. But this is the global problem par excellence, and it requires a global systemic response. My impression is that what we're getting is we are moving to some degree in parallel countries, but in very different speeds, very different extent, and with very different systems of very different efficiencies. So we're going to end up doing it, even if we move in the right direction, very inefficiently. Can we have a global solution? Do we need a global solution rather than this set of national solutions? I'd like to start with you on that, Christina. How do you see the relationship in these set of policy questions, it's hugely complicated, between what's going on at the national levels and, as it were, a genuinely efficient global answer and just global answer?
Well, obviously, if there were a magical top-down answer to this that would make sense for all countries, we would have had it. The fact is that the differences in economies are such, and the difference in natural resource bases are such, that there is no one-size-fits-all. And that, I think, is one of the many lessons from Copenhagen. Because I think in Copenhagen, there was an attempt at a one-size-fits-all. So the current approach, I think, is a hybrid approach, if you will. Yeah. It's a hybrid approach that seeks to optimize or maximize the contributions that can come from each economy based on the reality in that economy, but that also, and with the difficulties that you say, that there will be, if you will, a fast lane and a slower lane, and everybody will be doing things in a slightly different way. But if you think about it as a very broad highway, where you have a fast lane, a short lane, a faster lane, a slower lane, where every country can, so to speak, choose its vehicle of engagement, but where the highway leads in one direction and one only direction, which is toward low carbon and toward a climate neutral economy in the second half of the century, with no exits on this highway. And none of the vehicles of engagement chosen can have actually a reverse gear. They all have one, gear 1, 2, 3, or 4, but no reverse gear. That is the kind of complex, admittedly much more complex arrangement that is being prepared, but the one that currently, at the current realization of the complexity of this, is actually making sense. Then the question is going to be, once you have the one direction and you have the final destination, then how do you accelerate the different checkpoints along the way to see how are we progressing to the 2 degrees, how are we progressing with finance, how are we progressing with policy, and then do everything along the way to accelerate that. But frankly, I cannot conceive currently of anything that would be a simple solution for all countries because the realities are so different.
I'd like to turn to you, and then I'm going to give the last word in before we go to the World Bank and the IMF. Nick, you might have other points to make, but I understand fully what Christina is saying. It's obviously logical and politically sensible, but the conclusion would be that effectively around the world we're going to have very different actual and implicit pricing of carbon. And economists would say, yes, all economies are different, but the efficient solution would have the same price. So there will be costs to this. It may be the only way we can go, but the cost could be very, very large. With that sort of point, how would you respond to that? How do you feel this fits in with some of the other things you've talked about in terms of shifting investment, the cost of capital, cost of funding, and so forth, to get not just some sort of deal in COP21, but something that looks as though it's going to be actually really reasonably effective in delivering the outcome we all agree we want?
I think shared understanding and shared information can help a lot. Shared understanding, for example, that we're going to come in the INDCs in the COP21 around 55, 56 billion tons CO2 equivalent, when a 2-degree path would look more like 40 or so. You can argue plus or minus, depends what you assume about what happens later, but we're way off. So I think a shared understanding that we've come a long way in the INDCs, and that's well worth having, but we have a long way to go. That actually helps focus people's mind. Shared information about what other people are doing. I think people are stopping saying, well, why should we do anything because China's building all these coal-fired power stations? Well, people should know that coal has started to fall in China. So shared goals and shared understanding of the gaps, shared information would be very important. On the efficiency point, I think there's something still more important than the static allocation efficiency, and that's the dynamics of this. This is a story of extraordinarily fast learning. The reason that solar PV has come down so fast is because countries of Europe put on strong incentives, and the dynamism of China made cheap PV. It's a bit more complicated than that, but it's that kind of story. We have to think of these first and foremost in terms of learning processes, driving costs down, how we get technological change. I would put that before the static efficiency. If we can get the static efficiency, i.e. having the marginal cost of reducing the carbon equal right across the world, I'll take it, I'd love it. But it's the dynamic story, it's getting it moving, so this story of learning and driving down costs happens as fast as possible, and we share that story as much as we can. We should recognize and salute Elon Musk, who's going to share his battery technology.
So very briefly, just a minute or two at most each, before going to questions from the audience, I'd start with you, Jim Kim. In terms of the policy arrangements we see emerging, I'd be particularly interested in your assessment at this stage and what the World Bank really wants to say about this and what the World Bank can contribute to getting the right outcome. How is the World Bank going to make a decisive difference so that 20, 30 years from now, future generations can look back and say, this institution played a vital role in solving this problem?
Martin, let me start with, reasons for optimism. And one of the reasons for optimism is sort of how serious climate change is. When I came here, I just heard from the Peruvian officials that the waters, the warming of the waters that caused the El Nino phenomenon are already 3 to 4 degrees Celsius warmer than they were the last time we experienced El Nino. And so I really worry that the effects are going to be just enormous. And what happens, Martin, is that if you ask the insurance companies, what are the two biggest risks? They'll say pandemics and disasters from related to climate change. But with both of those, what we do is we panic and everyone pays attention while the phenomenon is occurring, like during Hurricane Sandy, and then we neglect. Panic, neglect, panic, neglect. And when I took this job, I asked our team, so what's the plan? What's the plan to get to 2 degrees Celsius? And they told me that, well, there's really not a clear plan, but think about what has changed and what we're going to do. So we've had a carbon price working group for a long time. Boy, the discussions have really advanced. We've been trying to help countries to remove fossil fuel subsidies. That conversation is still difficult. Politicians don't like it when taxi drivers and truck drivers block the streets. But there are 3 other things that we're committed to, which is cleaner, more livable cities, dramatically increased access to financing for sustainable energy, but also energy efficiency. And finally, probably the biggest no-brainer of all is climate-smart agriculture. I mean, increasing agricultural productivity in Africa is completely equivalent to engaging in forms of agriculture that are better for the environment. So these 5 things are our plan. I think what we need to do next, and I hope we're in a different place. When the next disaster occurs, we have to jump right in and say, here's the plan. And I just have to say, Nick and Christiane have been fantastic leaders. But the fact that Christine has gotten involved in this debate, and probably to the chagrin of some of her, people in her community, is so important. The IMF was not leading this debate 5 years ago. And so now that we are all agreed that these are things that we've got to do, the next time a disaster hits, we've got to hit hard and say, okay, here is the plan. Show us you care. Go, move forward. Here are 5 things for us. There are many more things to be done.
So last word from you, Christine. The role of the IMF, and how well are you doing in persuading our friends, the finance ministers, that they play a central role in this, which they obviously do, and that they have a golden opportunity to solve their fiscal problems and the fate of the planet at one time?
The power of the words. We're in a country where food is terrific, and I think that if we collectively chicken out of this, we'll all turn into chicken. We'll be fried, grilled, toasted, and roasted. So I think that's an imperative that if combined with a bit of technical assistance, training, good analytical work, will actually go a long way into convincing that subsidies have to be removed, as Jim just indicated, that price have to be determined properly, including externalities, that taxation is actually a better way than ETS, that financing some of those initiatives and working on sustainable growth, not sustainable because it lasts a long time, but because it's actually sustainable from an environmental point of view, is actually healthier and better for the economies. So we'll continue to do that. And by the way, we're teaming up with the World Bank, and we're working hard on those issues of removing subsidies and convincing our members that that's the way to go.
So at this stage, I'm going to take questions from the audience. We have a little while, not very much. I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions, perhaps 2 questions together at this stage. Then there are also some questions we're getting online. We'll also come to those. Please ask a question. If you address it to an individual, that will help, and please say who you are. So I'll start with the audience, and then maybe we'll take questions online. I can't see anything at the moment. I hope you're going to change the lighting so I can see somebody. Okay, there's a lady, I think, just here in the front. Would you stand up? Yes. Please give her the mic. Say who you are and a brief question.
Hello, my name is Rosa Acevedo. I'm from Peru. I'm quite concerned because the lack of, in this case, the lack of accountability of governments and also the lack of building capacity of governments in all levels, national, regional, and local, and corruption are, I think, the biggest threats along with the phenomenon del Niño here in Peru. So what can we do in order not only to face the phenomenon del Niño, but in general climate change in our country? And I think that's the reality in all countries, because these key things, you know, the lack of legitimacy in regional governments and local governments, the lack of building capacity and corruption, are, I think, the biggest issues that lock us in order to continue working.
I understand the question. I'd like to take a question a little further back. Yes, somebody in the 3rd row, I think. Yes, you. Yeah, you. The one who just... Wait a second. Wait, sorry, behind... Not you, you can come later. Sorry, I apologize. It's very difficult to... okay, quick question.
Hi, Daniel Goldman from Locus Analytics in New York. Thank you very much for a terrific discussion. Question for Madame Lagarde. In addition to the excellent suggestions regarding externalities, there remains the challenge that methods of accounting for growth at the national level assign 0 value to any set of particular natural resources until they're extracted, thus creating the impression that extractive regimes, whether fossil fuel or otherwise, are contributing to national growth, when even from a self-interested neoclassical economic short-term perspective, when these assets are liquidated for below fair market value, are actually representing a decline in national wealth and income. Would you advocate a method for accounting for national growth that would properly account for the value of natural resources, including fossil fuels, in the land, sea, and forests, that would provide incentives for governments to promote conservation? Okay. Thank you.
And I'll now take that lady in the front, please. Quickly.
Okay, it will be very short. Thank you. It's a question from Tunisia. It's the meaning time maybe to start reforms on subsidies, essentially for energy, and taking care about climate change, but how World Bank and IMF could help investing and launching private sector to take care about our planet.
So the question was, how do you get the private sector to take care about it?
Yes, take care about it, and more accountability for the public sector too.
Okay, I've actually got now 4 questions, because there's one on here. Does the fact that we are planning for 2020 mean that we can't act now? But these are, I think, excellent questions. I'm going to start with the question about governments and their accountability, expressing a profound skepticism about the ability of some governments, possibly most governments, to actually do anything effective about any of this. Should we be that skeptical about the capacity of governments to actually implement any of the sorts of policies and programs we're talking about, to the extent that the government is necessary? It's not only about government. I'm going to start with you, since it's about here with you, Jim Kim. What is your response?
You know, if you just look at one of the issues, removing fossil fuel subsidies, you know, again, from every perspective, it's such a no-brainer. It's a regressive tax. It puts more carbon in the air. You know, right now with low oil prices is the perfect time to get rid. And some, you know, to be fair, some governments are doing it. But when you're a politician, it's very inconvenient to have all the roads blocked, right? And so I do think that it requires a lot of courage right now to do the right thing. But I think that all of us in the global community have to set the conditions so that it gets more and more difficult to do things that we know are bad for people, don't help the poor preferentially, and are increasing pollution. So how do you hold them accountable? You know, there are things, I mean, I think everyone would like to live in cleaner, more livable cities. I think everyone would like to have access to clean energy. I think everyone would like to have more productive, more climate-smart agriculture. But in fact, it's probably the hardest things, committing to a price on carbon and getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. That will be the test for everybody. And I think we have to do our best to create the conditions where, from all your peers, every time you go to a meeting, you know, leaders will be asked about what progress they're making. And without those two, I worry about where we're going.
Can there may be others, because it seems to be a huge question. So I'll go to you, Nick Stern. We are talking, in addition to eliminating subsidies, even introducing some pricing, is technically easier, though politically very difficult. There are also things, we're talking about, as you've made very clear, massive reallocation of investment funds in three absolutely crucial areas: urban development, the power system, and the transport system. This is surely, it is realistic, and you're talking about 20 years. This is, to be realistic, and all of those things are centrally government responsibilities. So some governments, it's just a matter of fact, have greater capacity to do this sort of thing than others, and a lot will need, perhaps most, a great deal of help. Can we be optimistic that it can be done, and if so, how? That was, I think, the question here. And it expressed a profound skepticism, obviously.
I think skepticism that points you to look at problems and how to tackle them is healthy. Skepticism says, well, it's all too difficult, let's give up, is pointless. If you look, for example, at states in India that have started to price better for water and electricity and have coupled with a much better service for water and electricity, you find political saleability. If you bring in carbon pricing and have cash transfers to poorer people to offset that, and for example with the identity number system in India, they're becoming more and more capable of doing that, you can design reforms that recognize the political difficulty, see where it's coming from in terms of losers, and improve services and allocations and direct transfers to people in a way that overcomes it. Now, India is not perfect governance. China has changed very rapidly without perfect governance. I'm not trying to sell governance of my own country to anybody either. You can get things done if you think about the political economy of the problem sensibly. And I think it's one of the roles of the international institutions who've seen these things happen in different places to help with the design of those systems. Mexico's tax reform, which they've got through fairly recently, is another example of the way in which, if you do a number of things at the same time, you can handle some of these political economy questions. It's not easy, but it's not hopeless, and giving up hope is hopeless.
We have no disagreement on that. Cristina Figueres, one of the questions, you might have a comment on the one we just discussed, but the question was addressed is, which I think was a misunderstanding, but might be more general, that we're postponing action, that it's not going to be quick enough. The date 2020 was mentioned. So what is going to be done? I mean, given that we've got perhaps a 20-year window to re-engineer the world, what can be done, and to extent how convincing one can be that action will be quick enough?
Let me also, I'll get to that. I also just quickly wanted to answer the Peru question because
of course.
I think there's ample information about what Peru is already doing and will continue to do in the INDC, the Intended Nationally Determined Contribution of Peru, that was just submitted last week. So I refer you to that because the breadth of sectors in which Peru is already moving forward, both in energy and land use, is actually quite impressive. But let me take the question about private sector in 2020 because they're actually the same answer. Absolutely not true that we're waiting for 2020. The only thing that has a 2020 start date is the legal bindingness, if that were a word, but let's create it for today, the legal bindingness of the agreement that is going to emerge from Paris. That is the only thing that starts in 2020. The policies, the measures, the actions to address climate change are already underway, are accelerating, and they're accelerating primarily in the private sector and in subnational territories, so cities, provinces, states. That is where there's much more capacity to move quickly. I can't tell you the number of corporations that are either already climate neutral or are investing into renewable energy very quickly so that they can become climate neutral. Not because they want to save the world, but because for them it makes a fundamental sense. Same thing for cities, same thing for provinces. So the action is already underway. So the only thing that we're doing with 2020 is put a start date to the legal nature of this agreement, but certainly not to action. The action is already underway.
I'd like to turn to you, Christine Lagarde. There was a question addressed directly to you, but I'd be very happy if you have comments on the very rich discussion we've already had on governments and their role and how you persuade finance ministers to do the sensible thing, which is clearly very much in your area of responsibility at the fund. But the question was, how far should we at the very least insist that we redo the way we account for natural resources, and it's absolutely clear that GDP measures conventionally use for assume, as it were, implicitly that what is sustainable what is unsustainable is in fact sustainable. And how far is the fund itself, as a central institution in this regard, sort of really taking that issue seriously? But that's obviously central, but there are also the other questions you heard.
Okay. I think it was a question concerning the right measurements and
yes.
whether in fact GDP is actually the right way to measure or whether we should not take into account lots of other factors. I think the environment, the damage that we are causing to ourselves, there are other goods that are not well measured either. You know, if you look into cultural goods, for instance, they're not measured rightly. I would suggest that getting the price right is one step forward. I would also suggest that following on the initial work that was put together by the Commission that we actually set up in France back now 7 years ago by the Sen, Stiglitz and a few other economists when they got together and decided how they could improve the measurement of our economy, how they could really better assess value, is something that we have to continue doing because GDP is just not the right way to take those factors into account. So I personally support it, and I think that the OECD, which has picked up the work that was left not completed by these economists, should be really supported. And I don't think we'll get away from GDP, by the way, but I think that we have to also include other measurements of those goods that are not properly accounted for. Two additional things that I'd like to mention. One is I would completely agree with what Nick said. There are intelligent ways to design taxation. There are important times when they can be put in place, and now is a good time. And for those who don't necessarily have the political courage to do it, it can also be made completely tax neutral. So in other words, even if it's hard, it can be neutral, and you can actually sell it in such a way that people actually see the benefit of other taxation going down while taxation is going up on energy. So it's a tough call, but as I said, if we don't do it, we'll turn into chicken.
I'd like to ask you, Jim Kim, one final question which came up, and Christina addressed it, but it seems to me incredibly important, and we haven't focused much on it, which is the private sector. Yeah. And you must be very actively involved in discussions. In the end, the private sector is going to do most of the investment, both big and small. They have most of the technology. Public institutions can just provide the framework, and in infrastructure, of course, they do a lot of it. But how do you see, from your point of view, private sector involvement in any sense in recognizing they are the solution and recognizing the opportunities?
So three major ways, Martin. If you look right now at the companies that are out there really trying to lead, Coca-Cola is leading on this issue because they can't find water. And water, of course, is going to be a huge problem. And you know, if you ask Mukhtar Kent, he'll say, this is fundamental to the future of our business because water is going to be the teeth, as they say, of climate change, scarcity of water. You know, companies like Walmart have reduced their carbon emissions tremendously over time. And I think, you know, even the energy companies, you know, there was a very different discussion that happened in Davos and also at the UN General Assembly about the need to take action on this. But I think, again, what I'd love to see is when we get the prices right, when we have a price on carbon and move that forward, then I think what you'll see is a private sector shifting very quickly and focusing on innovation in the energy sector and in other ways of making their own activities more climate smart. That's the really critical piece of it. We've done 100 green bonds. We invented the green bond. We did 100 green bonds. There's a lot of activity out there. But it feels to me like sort of a supersaturated solution that's waiting for the catalyst. And in my mind, the catalyst will be a price on carbon.
Okay, what I'm going to do, since I think we can take perhaps 5 minutes before closing it, I want to give each of you the opportunity, because this is an extremely rich and important discussion. And we want to make sure that everybody leaves here entirely unconfused. So, and it really is amazing we're having this discussion if I think about where we were 5-10 years ago. So this is a really remarkable thing. So I'm going to go in reverse order from our opening, and you each have a minute to say what you think this audience needs really to understand about, from this discussion, about what the priorities are and why you think it's going to happen. Okay? And I'm going to start with you, Nick.
First, some basic understanding of the scale and urgency of change that's necessary. Second, that the transition to low carbon growth is the growth story of the future. It will help us overcome poverty and manage climate change at the same time. Those basic understandings are fundamental. In implementing action, I think I would put infrastructure at center stage, and for that to happen, you need good policies and good institutions, and we know more about what those are. Pricing carbon, regulating or pricing for the pollution, and so on would be absolutely fundamental, so the investors see what's necessary, and then getting the finance in place, and I would place the multilateral and national development banks absolutely at the center of that big expansion. Because if they can go up from 400 million, if they can go from 40 billion to 200 billion, then the leverage would give you much of what was necessary to get the extra $1 trillion a year in private sector investment you need. Good pricing for carbon, you could finance the public sector investment as well. So in my response, I'd focus on infrastructure, and with both the incentive structures and the finance at center stage, and infrastructure designed and priced particularly for poor people.
Christina, your reply.
I would summarize 3 points. There is enormous opportunity here to revitalize economies and to address poverty through the solutions to climate change. So that overlap is a absolutely historical opportunity that is facing us in the face, right in front of us, and that we must take. Point number one. Point number two, that opportunity cannot cloud what we need to do for those who are being negatively affected. So we can't let our enthusiasm about the opportunity take us into Pollyanna land and forget about those who must be brought forward. And it is our collective duty here, certainly, to make sure that no country is left behind. And point number three, all of this, to Nick's point, all of this will only be possible if we fast forward and accelerate this over the next 20 years. That is what is scary about it. If we had 50 or 100 years to do this, I would say no problem, because frankly, we're already moving in that direction. What we need to do as leaders, and everybody needs to do, is to make sure that we do what we know we have to do, but at an accelerated pace, because otherwise, it doesn't matter how much we decide to address climate change. If we do not do it fundamentally and turn the corner in the next 20 years, it's gone.
Jim.
You know, Martin, one of the great things that I've learned, being a development person, a physician anthropologist who's now working as a banker, one of the great things is that it turns out that so many of our moral and ethical imperatives turn out also to be the right thing to do economically. For example, fighting sexism is really important. It also turns out to be the right thing to do for your economies. And so many advanced economies are learning that participation of women in the workforce, in other words, reducing sexism, is the right thing. Look at the migrant issue. I recently wrote an op-ed saying, look, for advanced economies in which the elderly population is increasing, the workforce is shrinking, the birth rate is low, actually welcoming people from outside your country is not just the nice thing to do, the tolerant thing to do, it's also the economically smart thing to do. Never has there been a clearer case in which doing the right thing by our children and grandchildren is also the economically smart thing to do. And right now we need some very courageous decision-making among all of us and our leaders to get the incentives right, to get the prices right. And at that point, I think everyone will see much more clearly that tackling climate change is not only the right thing to do by our children, it's the right thing to do to protect the economy. The two greatest downside risks to the economy, according to the insurance industry, are unabated pandemics and the disasters that are going to come, many related to climate change. It is a downside risk to the global economy, and it's also the right thing to do by our children. You can't get much better than that, but it's going to take courage.
Last word of the panel to you.
I would say to Finance Minister, go home, price it right, tax it smart, do it now. And I would say to civil, wait. I would say to civil society representatives, and I think it goes to the accountability point, and I can say that because I tried when I was finance minister and I failed to put that in place. My country has done it now. There were much better finance ministers after me. I would say to civil society, support those finance ministers who have the courage to do it. Support them. Don't bash them, support them. They will need it. Thank you.
Unfortunately, I don't have the half an hour required to summarize this discussion, or perhaps fortunately. I'd just make 2 points. The first is to remind you, because you might not have all taken it down, that we are threatened with being fried, grilled, toasted, and roasted, which is a very, very nice clause, and if spontaneous, remarkable. The second point I would make is I take completely, because of course the panel is right to do so, there are great opportunities, and if we get it right, we should be optimistic. But I think we should have no illusions about the nature of the challenge. Let's be very, very clear. What everybody here is saying is that 20 years from now, our basic transport, energy, and urban infrastructure, the systems we live with, on the basis of which our lives are now increasingly built, just look at Lima. In an urbanizing world, half the population of the world is already urban, and it will be more. They have to be completely different. And that means that the investment pattern of the world has to start being different now, because all these are the world's longest-lasting physical infrastructure. We are talking about systems which will be in place and operation, in the case of power systems and urban systems, half a century or a century from now. Just look at our existing cities. So if you are optimistic about the outcome, which you should be, the optimism must rest on the assumption that policymakers and the private sector are going to transform what we're doing now. And if that is to happen, then there has to be a tremendous amount of pressure on policymakers, not only to say the right thing, which by and large they are, and even to indicate they have some intentions in the right direction, but actually to deliver changes which will deliver those outcomes. And my own perspective on this is that there is the opportunity, there is the potential, but this is not where we are now. And therefore, and I think it was very clear from what Cristina Figueres said about what COP21 is likely to deliver. Or Nick, maybe it was Nick Sand. So if you agree with the panelists, and it's been a wonderful panel, the lesson you should take away is a lot more needs to be expected from our policymakers than they now rather complacently think is perfectly adequate. And if they're going to change, it needs a lot of pressure from you and a lot more of us around the world. So that's my conclusion from this discussion. I think it's been a wonderful and certainly a sort of discussion, a lot of consensus on what needs to be done, but a lot more needs to be done as well. May I thank the panelists for this discussion. Thank you.